Hello and welcome to this week's edition of The Advance. I'm Kevin Roberts, your host. Each week we come to you with the pressing issue of the day. Today is Constitution Day, so you might say it's the pressing issue always for the United States, for all of us as Americans. And while we're going to be optimistic as usual about the future, unfortunately today my guest and I will have to be realistic about the present. I'm coming to you from Central Texas, where news every hour gets worse when it comes to the border crisis. The context for that, as an example, is the Biden-Harris administration not only not doing its job, but purposefully destabilizing Texas and other states that border the nation of Mexico. Our guest and my good friend, Brett Tolman, is a former U.S. attorney. He is also director of the Texas Public Policy Foundation's Right on Crime unit. That's our conservative criminal justice reform effort. And Brett, given his experience, his knowledge of the Constitution, will give us a really thorough commentary and analysis about what's going on today. So, as is typical for this broadcast, we're going to spend a little bit of time kind of unpacking the problems for you, and then we're pretty quickly going to get to your questions. So if you have a question, sit tight. We'll get to it in just a moment. But in the meantime, Brett Tolman, thanks so much for making time for this today.
Kevin, great to be with you. If not personally with you, this is as good as we can get.
So, each of us is in a remote office of Texas Public Policy Foundation, you on the outskirts of Salt Lake City and I on the outskirts of Austin. And so it's a great advantage to be able to use technology to our benefit. And so I just want to start with a high level question, Brett. We'll eventually get into some of the work that you're doing in Texas and beyond. But given your experience as a former U.S. attorney, many years spent on Capitol Hill as a staffer, your knowledge of the Constitution, what is at stake regarding our constitutional republic, given all of the terrible decisions of the last several months?
Yeah, Kevin, thanks. I sit back on occasion and I just am astounded at where we're at as a country based on the policies and the implementation of policies that, especially over the last few presidencies. Even if you want to look at on a macro level, it's amazing to me we have this group of people that are in power, and I include the executive branch, I include legislators, in Congress, a group of people that are in power that have somehow assessed the Constitution as a document that they know is out there, but how much they've really studied or understood the nature of that document is starting to become alarming to me. And it's also happening to our younger generations that are growing. And what I mean by this is the document itself is not intended to be a list of what the government can give you as a citizen of this country. It's intended to be a restriction on what the government can take from you as a citizen. So our Constitution is a unique document because it's the first time in the history of the world that there was a document that actually said, these are the things that the government cannot take from you. These are the things that you have and they are yours. And for me, what we're seeing now is the destruction of that understanding at its core.
Well, I'm grateful for that summary because it in the middle of that really tough analysis about what's at stake is a set of hopeful comments. And I say that because, Brett, in previous years, as our foundation has done a live stream or an in-person event for Constitution Day, it's really the thrust of those have really been about why we should love the Constitution and love America. And it's very telling to me that in the span of just a year, our own mindset was we're going to take for granted that people tuning in understand what there is to love about America and the Constitution, although we'll come back to that in a little while. What really has become urgent, and this is coming from me and from you, neither of us engage in hyperbole, is the future of this country. And I know we hear that a lot from politicians, but you're an attorney, very knowledgeable of the Constitution. I run a think tank and I'm a historian. We don't go around life using that kind of verbiage, right? That the situation is truly urgent. I'm telling you, my friend, I'm talking to people who are at the border right now around Del Rio. it's urgent. I mean, this is literally life or death, because to come full circle in this extended run up to a follow up question to you, the Biden Harris administration refuses to obey what the Constitution says. And so we can get into some of the immigration debate, but I want to give our audience a little bit of optimism early, because I know a lot of people tuning in are feeling really beaten down. And so, what's a glimpse of hopefulness for the future that we're going to be able to navigate this rough stretch and emerge on the other side of this an even stronger republic?
I think where the silver lining is, and what gives me hope, is that we are actually now able to see what it is like when the government usurps authority that it doesn't have. So we have this, it's a bitter pill to swallow, but we are actually getting to see what it's like when you detach yourself from the Constitution. When the executive branch believes that it has so much power that it can ignore our founding document and the restrictions it places on government, we finally are getting to see what results come from that, that over-aggressive consumption of power. So when we see what's happening at the border, when we see the mandates, the executive order, and when we see what they're doing to red states with respect to life-saving, medicine that for vaccinated and unvaccinated, when we start to see those overreaches, that's what gives me hope, is that people now are turning to the Constitution and saying, wait, okay, I need to understand this because this looks like it's out of line. So the hope for me is we're seeing the terrible results of these policy decisions. And I think that will mean change. And that will mean people that get into Congress, for example, that are going to put a check on the executive branch. That means individuals are going to run for office who have a better appreciation of how bad it can be when government abuses its power.
Yeah, I think that ought to motivate a lot of people to sort of steel their resolve and be hopeful about the future. And so I want to follow up with that by prompting you maybe to tell a little bit about your own personal motivations for studying the law, for becoming an attorney and then U.S. attorney, Capitol Hill staffer. Maybe in that story I actually happen to know in that story is a deep love for the Constitution and an intention to, by you, to pay forward what you believe you've been given as an American. I'd love for our audience members to hear that.
Yeah, thank you, Kevin. I was very fortunate to have a very humble, amazing father who had deep respect for, the Constitution, for our founding fathers. And he used to say to me that there would be a time when it would be lawyers that would save the Constitution. Now, I'll tell you, lawyers are not always my favorite people, and I'm certainly sorry to my wife for when she has to deal with me on a day-to-day basis as a lawyer. But that stuck with me, and it was very powerful that my father believed that it would be lawyers and good men and women who would be willing to serve that would save the Constitution. And what he meant by that is the real solid belief that he was observing during his lifetime, the whittling away of the importance of the Constitution and the growth of the government, especially the federal government. And so, I am the product of a mother and a father who were simple and God-fearing and loving, but at their foundation, they had a respect for the Constitution that was instilled in me and my siblings. And so I was bound and determined. I was going to be a lawyer that served in government, and I was going to be a lawyer that wanted to make a difference. And so I was proud to serve in the Senate, and I worked on many issues, including constitutional amendments and the dynamic of watching Congress grapple with having to stay anchored to a document. The more I dug into that document, the more I dug into the cases that I would eventually work on that involved, many of the amendments to the Constitution and our due process rights and all that we have been given. My respect grew for the document itself, and my respect has grown for the need of great men and women to step up and to defend this Constitution.
So thank you for that. Tell us, especially for those in the audience not as familiar with the phrase conservative criminal justice reform, what the work is that you and our colleagues in Right on Crime do, and in particular, how that not only pertains to the Constitution, but is really animated by our love for it.
You know, Kevin, I watch today what's happening when we have a very far left administration, very liberal thinking and policymaking, which, by the way, the difference between the left and the right is the left makes policy based on emotion and based on anecdote. What I mean is an event occurs and they immediately and emotionally want to respond. The right is anchored in data, in research, history, and trying to implement a policy that achieves the actual result that you're intending. And so with criminal justice reform, it's fascinating to me. We watched the left, crying and screaming about defunding the police until they actually started to implement defunding the police, and now they're panicked and now they're in trouble. And now these cities are scrambling. They can't retain police officers. They have policies that are hurting the community. So at Right on Crime, our highest priority is to utilize data and research on reforms that work. Because let's face it, everybody in this country is being affected by the criminal justice system, and they all know there are broken pieces or parts of the criminal justice system in this country. But you cannot reform that in a way that is just emotion-based. It has to be from data, research, and that's what we're trying to do across the country.
Yeah, and I just think about some of the successes we've had in Texas and Louisiana and beginning to have in Mississippi. This policy over the last 10, 15 years has really touched almost every American because it's been active in almost every state. And so to move away from the specific example of criminal justice reform and back to the broader context in which that and other policies happen, I'm gonna queue up one of the first audience questions because I think it's timely just in the give and take that you and I are having. If someone today is sitting here watching this and saying, yes, Brett and Kevin, I agree with you. The Constitution is important. I agree with you that the current administration is problematic. For that matter, we might make an argument the last several executive administrations have been, regardless of party, which is to say the executive branch has become too powerful. But where I disagree with the two of you, this audience member suggests, is that actually the future is bright, that we're living in a post-constitutional republic. This audience member is seeking some advice from you about how they can get past that sense of demise.
It's difficult. That is a difficult one right now. What I would say is don't believe that the amplifying that is being done by the media is indicative of the strength of this country's resolve to work through this. The media is, by and large, being driven by, whether it's big tech or whether it's mainstream media, they are being driven by an agenda. An agenda that we see is to try to support and push the left's agenda. If you set that aside, you will, if you get engaged on this issue, you will start to see in states across this country, in Texas, in Louisiana, in Florida, in Utah, there are forces that are assembling and realizing that too much power has been given to the executive branch, too much power has been given to the federal government, and you're starting to see at a state level. That's where I want people to get involved. If you want hope, start engaging at the state level in your state, whether it's a school board that you're going to engage with, or whether it's the legislature, whether you run for office or not, or whether you lead a team. Right now, I can say I lead a team of incredible state directors and people that are devoted every single day to making change. And guess what? They are making change. And they're doing it in a thoughtful, data-driven, research-driven way And so if we can do that, and we're just regular people, we just got engaged on the issue, then every single person out there that feels hopeless, ignore that media agenda and ignore all that and just start rolling up sleeves and getting involved. And that's how this country returns to a better place.
Yeah, it's really true. And I'll offer a couple of other quick examples for this audience member. One is critical race theory, which is an abomination. And it's a violation of the Constitution because it explicitly violates the Civil Rights Act, the foundation of which is the 14th Amendment, because it defines everyone according to immutable characteristics, namely race. We're winning on that issue. I mean, it's
Yes.
unfortunate that there had to be thousands of schools already implementing critical race theory for us in the policy world and for parents to recognize it. But the point is, to the point you just made about paying attention to local communities, we're winning. We've passed really good laws in Texas and many other states. We have potential lawsuit coming up that our organization will be party to against the U.S. Department of Education on the grounds of this violating the Civil Rights Act. We're going to win, not just in our lifetime, but in the next 6 or 12 months. And then even though the situation on the border, especially here in Texas, is an abomination, it's a gross violation by the President of the United States of his duties to us, his moral duties to protect his people. We're going to win on that issue because what it's done is spawned great action by Governor Greg Abbott, which will only become more escalated for the state to do what the federal government should be doing. So I guess that underscores the point that in 2021, we're having to endure a lot of difficulties that come from bad policy decisions and from not just federal overreach generally, but executive branch overreach. But the people, to your point, this is really crucial for us to understand, have awakened to that. And I think it's incumbent on us, not just you and me, but people watching this broadcast to harness that energy and do something positive about it. And so that leads me, Brett, to the next audience question, which is also excellent. And this person writes, it seems like the term unconstitutional gets thrown around whenever one side disagrees with whatever the other side is doing. What's the best way to know what's constitutional or not?
So, I saw that question, and I like the question because we do see that, we hear that, it's thrown around a lot. Everybody says that's unconstitutional, and when they usually are saying it, it's based on just a general sort of perception that the Constitution is protecting our civil liberties, and it's protecting our rights. And I go back to again, understand that the Constitution is a document that restricts government, not you. And so if anybody is starting to talk to you about what's unconstitutional, ask yourself, is it in relation to what the government is doing or what an individual is doing? But I would also say, keep in mind that one of the most important parts of that document is to organize the structure of power when you bring all these states together and form a union. And where is the centralized power? Their intention was to not have centralized power in Washington, D.C. So if it's federal government action that somebody is saying, hey, that's unconstitutional, the most common way to assess the accuracy of that is, are they encroaching on the state's authorities? Because that's where our founders so wisely said, we will give almost all power that we give to a government in the states, because they did not want a centralized power. And that's why they didn't make Washington, D.C. a state. They made it a district. That's why they attempt to limit it. And that's why it's so important that we bring those lawsuits that you have outlined, because that is the only way that we are putting in check an executive branch that, or a federal government that's actually consuming power and pulling from the states. When you see Governor Abbott and you see Governor DeSantis or Governor Noem or Governor Stitt in Oklahoma or Governor Reeves in Mississippi, and they're pushing back to make policy and to pass laws to limit the federal government, that tells you something. It tells you that the federal government is ignoring the underlying purpose of the Constitution.
Let me ask you, this is a question for me, but a follow-up to the question the smart audience member just posed. If I gave you a magic wand and I said, Brett, you can change one thing about the violations of the Constitution, what one thing do you wave that wand and fix? In other words, what's the number one threat to sustaining our constitutional republic?
Right now, it's executive orders by the President of the United States. I would wave that wand and I would limit his ability to issue executive orders immediately.
And, I won't go into detail in the interest of time, but the point is, with your point there about executive orders, you could apply that to literally every major public policy issue in the United States.
That's
and
right.
The fact that you can proves the point, right? We shouldn't have executive orders on every public policy.
And governors are doing it too. They're gaining confidence, and Republicans have done it. Donald Trump did it. Bush did it. They all have the intrigue and the fascination with the president's pen, and they get sick and tired of Congress inaction. And I understand that. I get that. Congress has been trying to fix issues on immigration since I can remember, and they've done nothing on it. And so a president gets arguably very frustrated. But the answer is not to expand one part of the government to give them such power as what we've seen.
Yeah. Well, thanks for that. I'll move on to a little bit broader question that's also forward looking. And this audience member asks, what's the best way to learn, study, and understand the Constitution?
First of all, it is to engage with organizations like TPPF. I'm not just putting a plug in for that, but you have organizations like TPPF or like the Heritage Foundation or the Federalist Society. These are organizations that are they're building policies around an appreciation and an understanding of the Constitution. So you certainly can utilize them as resources. I'm surprised at how few people have read the Federalist Papers. I'm surprised at how few people are reading the actual Constitution. And the number of, when I was teaching for a while at the law school as an adjunct professor here in Utah, and I had law students got through law school and never read the Constitution. So if they're not reading the Constitution, what hope do we have when our education system is being hijacked by policy agendas? And so I would say you have to dig in, start reading, and do it at your own pace. Consult with some of these groups that can give you insights. And then there are great scholars around the country that would just absolutely love to spend time with anybody interested in it. And so reach out to them. Now with social media, you can reach out to anybody and ask them if they're willing to sit down with you, have a Zoom conversation, and encourage them to continue their studies.
That's a great use of social media. In fact, every scholar of the Constitution or the Federalist Papers I know loves answering questions, right? They have hearts of teachers, and it doesn't matter who you are. They're very happy to respond to your email or to your private message on a social media platform. And I'd also recommend, in addition to the good list you mentioned, Hillsdale College has free courses, and a couple of them are on the Federalist Papers. And last thing I'll say is, I'm writing this book on the Constitution and America. Is basically a book that reminds us why what we're doing as a people is so important. And I got tired of hearing myself say, go read the Constitution. So I said this morning, how long does it take to read the Constitution? 16 minutes from the first word to the last word of the last amendment. I think we should all do that today. And I can tell you that I learned something new, even though I've taught the Constitution every single time I read it. It's a very rich document without a lot of words, because the context of the Constitution is as motivating, it's as moving as the document itself. And it was men and women coming together at a very particular time in history, obviously at a very particular place, 234 years ago, with the gentleman adopting the Constitution in Philadelphia. But to even get to that point was transformational, to say the least. That's not a strong enough word in human history, so we really ought to cherish it.
Well, Kevin, I would point out to those that really want to appreciate the Constitution, and we were dealing with a group of individuals who saw government at its worst. They had seen it at their worst, and their whole motivation was to avoid those problems. They saw not necessarily into the future, but because they looked at the past, they could understand what the Constitution needed in order to avoid that. When we get away from the history of it, then we lose the ability to be governed by it. George Washington is one of the few men in history, there were maybe only two men in history, who was a conquering general, who had absolute command of the military, who handed back the charter that gave him authority to use the military. And he did so because he was a product of an understanding of the history of when government abuses its citizen and its powers. And so if you're going to study that, study these people, study that history as well. And then you'll start to understand the Constitution and the importance of it.
Yeah, that's really well said. One of our audience friends is asking a tough question, and I can only presume, because I've heard people soliciting this advice from us for the last several months as we fight critical race theory. They say, what do you say to someone who says, the Constitution isn't for me, it's a racist document?
In the history of the world, there has not been a country that's been established to give freedom to all men, equality to all men. These were imperfect individuals, certainly. They were also a product of their time. That doesn't excuse that if there were violations of, civil rights that occurred. But you can't see that in the document, because they did know that the power of the government to discriminate between individuals, whether they did it based on gender or whether they did it based on race, they understood that, they knew that. And our country had to grow and it had to learn from mistakes. And right now you have a country that whether you're black, brown, white, male, female, if you have a desire to go to college, if you have a desire to work, to own your own business, to own property, you can do that in this country. That doesn't mean we don't have things to fix in this country, but it certainly also doesn't mean that document doesn't extend all of those rights equally to men and women in this country.
That's right. I mean, the document itself is what gives us the ability to correct injustice. And in fact, it has been used to do so more nobly than any other republic, any other civilization in the history of the world, even with the imperfections of the 19th century. So I'm really glad that you said what you did. Well, I could talk to you forever. We talk often in our daily work, and I'm glad that we're able to have this conversation publicly, because our audience for the advance has learned that you're someone they need to know if they didn't know that already. So I'll close, Brett, by asking you the typical final question. Being an optimist, leading a team of optimists at the Texas Public Policy Foundation, I want to ask you, why did you wake up this morning in spite of all the reasons to be pessimistic about the future of America, optimistic about
it? I wake up optimistic every day. I get discouraged when it comes to what we are seeing in our government. I get discouraged, but I still have freedom. Every day I wake up, I have enormous amount of respect for where we're at as a country. We've seen that slip, but we are certainly not a country that is without resolve to make it better and to fix it. And I wake up with optimism because I know that we have an election coming up, for example, and we have a great chance of gaining back one house or the other. And that if we do, we will put in check in a greater, with greater capability, the executive branch. And then I have hope and optimism that the country finally got to see what it was like to have an out of control administration. And that I hope leads to a better election for the presidency and a deeper appreciation. When you have 25+% of Biden voters indicating that they regret their vote, it gives me optimism and hope that they needed to see what it would be like to have someone that is without balance, without measure, and with unbridled thirst for power, what it's like to have someone like that in the White House.
And sometimes unfortunately, it takes those examples of our worst nature as leaders for Americans to wake up. Because one thing, if de Tocqueville were sitting with us in this conversation, he would say one thing that's always true about Americans. It's true in the 21st century, even with all of the changes since he toured the country in the 1820s and 30s, is that we go about the more important business of our lives, our family members, our friends, our communities, our job, our businesses, our churches, et cetera. And those are more important than politics and policy. But because the executive branch has become so powerful, very much in violation of the Constitution, we're going to have to take a little more time from those things to make sure that we get to the point that we can have some more victories, whether they be electoral, as you mentioned, or whether they be policy victories, which I will remind everyone are very numerous. So, Brett Tolman, thanks so much for the work you do. You're a great patriot, and I'm hopeful that everyone watching this will come to know you and your work better. Thanks so much for being a real advocate for our constitutional republic. And for those of you who make this show possible, thanks for tuning in. We'll join you next week. I can tell you we already have in the works the guests and the topics for the next couple of installments of the Advance, and they're really going to dovetail nicely with the conversation that Brett and I just had. Y'all take care. May the Lord continue to bless this great country.